everybody. Happy Thursday. We're going to go ahead and get started with our next lesson. And just for fun, happy US Bowling League Day. So, in the past couple lessons, you've learned some of the basics about geography. You've learned about what geography is. You've learned about the two different branches of geography, with physical geography being about the physical land. You've learned about human geography and how it studies all of us and the different people across the world and how we interact with one another and the earth that we're on. And you've learned that geographers kind of pick one or the other to focus on. But regardless of what field that they go into or what field that they study, they have to look very carefully at the world around them. And to do this, they often look at three different levels. So they break the world into three different levels. These are the local level, the regional level, and the global level. And we're going to look at all three and focus on their basics and what kinds of things geographers look at when they're looking at these different levels. So we're going to start with the local level. At the local level, geographers are mainly studying issues on a smaller scale. So they're looking at cities or towns or counties. They're looking at a smaller area of the world to really focus on. And when you had your very first lesson and you had some questions asked that were about the city of Frankfurt, those are the types of questions that geographers who are studying the local level are going to ask as well. So they're going to be wanting to know what the government is like, how people who live there get from place to place, what types of homes do they live in, where do they live in the city, and how do they get their resources and things that they need. And by asking these questions, geographers are figuring out why people live and work the way that they do, which is a big thing for geographers. They want to know why people are living in certain places and how they are living there, what they need when they're there, what kinds of things can they get from their areas, and why are they working and living this way. This also allows geographers to help find ways to improve people's lives. So, for an example, a geographer who is studying at the local level can look at the population and see that the population is fairly large, but there's no hospital in the area. All the people who are sick or hurt have to go to a different city in order to get medical help. So, they can work with city officials to know where the best places for the hospital should be, or just to let them know, hey, you need some more medical options for the people who live here. And this is the same for things like building new schools or building new stores and things like that. They can help the city officials understand what things need to be in their area. So, just an example, a geographer could look at the city of London, so London, England, and they could look at a snapshot, or they could be standing right here, and this is the view that they see. But they can look in just from this view alone. They can see the different types of transportation that they use. So there's personal cars and there's city buses, and people are walking from place to place. This gentleman looks like he's working that day, so he's probably walking to or from work. They can see that a lot of people have access to restaurants and stores, so they can get the food and things that they need. Looking at housing and seeing that there's a lot of apartments and things, and looking at the types of clothing people are wearing or that's available to them, so they can understand the types of needs that are being met or just better understand the people who live in this area. And geographers who study the local level also study the communities that people live in. And communities are just groups of people who live in the same area or share a common interest or common characteristics. And they identify communities in three different ways. So you have urban, suburban, and rural. So an urban community is pretty much what we think of as cities. They have very high population, so a lot of people are living there. Their buildings are typically fairly close together. Sometimes they have skyscrapers or they're just tall buildings. They're multi complex units, so there's a lot of different things that can go in them. People live in them, they work in them. There's different companies who are all in the same building, but the buildings are fairly close together. Homes are very close together. Um, Usually, homes, work, stores, recreational activities can be found either near each other or in the same buildings or within a couple blocks from one another. And the primary mode of transportation is going to be public transportation. So people do have their own cars and there is private transportation. But the big cities are where you're going to find the bigger busing systems or subways and things like that. The next one is suburban communities. And suburban communities are pretty much just what we know as suburbs. They have a lot of the same options and opportunities as cities do, but they're not right on top of each other. So you think of cities and you think of all the buildings being super close and everything jam packed in one little area and a couple blocks, and you can find everything that you need. Suburbs have all those things, but they're typically more spread out. So there are fewer people who live in the suburbs typically than in a city. Houses are more common. So, yes, there are apartments and multi people housing options, but you have more housing options, and you think of houses with yards and things like that being more common in a suburb. And that goes into more green space. So, you do have more yards, you do have more areas that are just driving down the road, and there's a bunch of trees and grass and things alongside the road. So, you have more green space. And then more people are using private transportation, so they're driving their own cars. Yes, there are buses and things in these areas, but typically more people use private transportation. And then you have rural communities, and this is typically what we think of as the country. Um, so a lot of the land in this area is used for agriculture, so farming, growing crops, and raising animals for food, and for forestry, so just natural areas that trees are growing that are protected by the city or the state, caring for forest, things like that. These communities can still have just as many opportunities, but they're fairly spread out. And this means that people don't typically have next door neighbors. They are kind of farther apart than others. And this also means they're farther apart from their resources and things like schools and stores and hospitals. So when we think of these different communities, Louisville is definitely an urban community, fairly big city. You think of like downtown Louisville with all the buildings and everything close together, very large population. Frankfort is technically a suburban community. We still have stores and schools and hospitals and all of those different things, but we're more spread out and we have more green space. And then rural communities are going to be more of some of the areas, like if you think of some Eastern Kentucky areas where you drive through and you have houses every now and then, um, but it's not so much a city base and the people are living farther apart from one another. So these are the three communities that a geographer can look at when they're looking at the local level. So, at the regional level, geographers are studying a bigger area and they divide the world into regions. So, this can be looking at states or countries, or it can be regions that are created that do not have specific boundaries. So, a region is a part of the world that has one or more features that separate it from other areas. So, when they're looking at these regions, it could be based on their climate, it can be based on the people and the different cultural things, but it doesn't have to be just like a state or a country. It can be a group of them. By breaking the world into these smaller regions, it's a lot easier for geographers to study them. It's a lot easier than studying at a larger level, or they might find more information than they would at the local level. So it allows them to see how these different people in different areas interact with each other and can compare one region to another. So there's different types of regions, just like with the branches, you have physical characteristics and human ones that help us identify regions. So physical characteristics would be things like mountain ranges or climates, plants native to an area. So they're seeing if these areas have similarities in the physical aspects that make them who they are and kind of group them together. So for example, you have the map over here of the US regions, and the US regions are primarily based on climate. So typically these areas that are grouped together, so you have like the Northeast and the Southeast, you have the Midwest and the Southwest, the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific. These regions are grouped together because for the most part, they have similarities in land type or climate. The weather patterns that they have are very similar. So that's something that a geographer at the regional level could pick one of these regions to focus on. Or it can be based on human characteristics. So they're looking at what similarities the people have. Is it an area where most people speak the same language or have the same history or practice the same cultural things like religion? So the example is in Northern Europe, there's a region called Scandinavia, and it's a bunch of these countries, and they're all separate countries, but they're grouped together because they have similar languages and similar cultural aspects and some of the same history. Um, so they're easily grouped together and called Scandinavia, even though they're separate countries because of those similarities that they have. So a geographer could look at this region and then compare it to others to see what differences they have. So I skipped that last slide. Sorry, I'll go back. The regional level, applying it to London again, London can technically be a regional level because it is so broad and goes outside of the city base as well. It has some cultural aspects and things like that that spread farther than the city itself. So a geographer could study London as a region to see how it impacts all these other areas and see how the population and transportation or languages, the different foods, all of these different things have a wider impact. And then the last level is the global level. So the global level is when geographers study the whole world. They're looking at how different areas interact and how different people interact with one another. They are seeing how different events and ideas from one region can then turn around and affect people in other regions. And they're looking at how all of the different relationships with people and places really affect one another. So, for an example, in the last 20 so years, technology, communication, and trade from places all over the world with one another has greatly increased. So, for example, you can get on any social media platform and find people from different countries. You can get on different websites like Amazon and things and purchase items from all over the world. This was not available up until the last, like I said, 20 so odd years. Um, but geographers can look at those ideas or look at those practices that we're doing and see how our actions and interactions are affecting different people and looking at how this interconnectedness that we're all having with one another is having a global impact. And then they can study how things like trade or disease and technology, government interactions, different wars going on, how it's really affecting everybody around the world, or how it is affecting them, and then see what different decisions can be made or should be made, or what things need to be watched. So they can really help us figure out how to live in this ever changing world that we're a part of. So, again, just a quick example London is here. It's a city, it's this little spot, but it is a major financial center in the world. So, a geographer can study how this one city's economy and how it's interacting with places all over the world and how that affects the different people who are involved. So, you've just watched the video. Your next steps are to look at the extra help things. So the slides are available. There are a couple PDF documents, and there are some images and things that you can look at. And then you have assignment number 2, which is a Google form. This form is a formative, so it's very important that you go back and check everything you need to or rewatch the video to make sure that you are good to go. Otherwise, you all have a great rest of your day, and I'm here if you need help.